So now on Esoteric Cliffnotes, we have Telepathy in Search of a Lost Faculty by Eileen J. Garrett. And so this book actually showed up in, I want to say, The Magic of Believing. And she was noted as a medium of sorts with telepathic abilities. So this is a bit of a personal story. She considers herself as sensitive. So I'll skip through the preface. And then in the introduction, I don't think there's really too much going on here. Here in the introduction, they mention Joan of Arc, La Pucelle of France, and the visions that they had. So Joan of Arc had visions, and that's what led her to doing all of the things that she did, and mentioning that these visions come from a high command. So just noting some other folks in history that seem to have had harnessed this gift. So chapter 1, or a subjective approach. The scope of telepathy is defined, how it works, how it differs from clairvoyance and clairaudience. Okay, so she says, when I stress at this point that in my opinion, telepathy presupposes a use of the emotions, I mean exactly what I say. I believe that true telepathic communication can only be obtained through emotional transmission and reception. Out of such emotional experiences can later be developed an intellectual concept. But I am convinced that telepathy cannot be successfully produced by a purely mental approach. The attitude of an experimenter, as I've already noted, who insists upon suppressing all emotional response, if such a complete suppression is truly possible, sets up a barrier which completely defeats telepathic experience and therefore, of course, defeats his own end, unless, that is, a negative result is the experimenter's perceived goal. And that's pretty much it for chapter 1 that I found was interesting. Chapter 2, a critical and historical survey. The ancient origins of telepathy are traced. Telepathy moves into the laboratory. Contemporary experiments of importance. She mentions Upton Sinclair's mental radio. It's funny, there wasn't really anything interesting that I found in this chapter, maybe just because I was already familiar with it. Yeah, there's one that she kind of mentions where some folks were on an expedition and they telepathically communicated to somebody that wasn't on that expedition, kind of every day something. and all that was confirmed after the fact. So in that expedition, obviously this was back then, there were no phones. I mean, yeah, there were no phones. I mean, this book was published in 41. They weren't able to send letters, so this is all pretty cool. Chapter 3, The Function of Symbolism and Telepathy. Symbolism is explained and an example given. Its part in achieving alertness. It may provide an escape from a too mundane environment. I mean, this was a great book, but for some weird reason, not much is coming up. Okay, so here we go. So she summarizes the three most important points, which she says I've endeavored to bring out. Symbology is utilized by me entirely as a key to that state of alertness in which I can best work telepathically. 2. When that alertness is present, I attain a super consciousness, which makes possible valid and clear telepathic communication. 3. Neither the subconscious nor the normal mind are instrumental in telepathy. The symbol of the yew tree, which I use to bring about the prerequisite alertness, is then the key to the garden of the oversoul, or impersonal consciousness, in which the melody of harmonious knowing forever greets my ear, a state of superconsciousness. As I understand the process by which I am telepathic, I feel that I am particularly in an experiment which is happening outside of myself, and that through a process of selectivity, I am able to know this process for myself as it is being received into the common collective thinking of the universe. It is like a storehouse to which I gain the entry the moment that I accept the fact that this universal consciousness, I perceive of both a belief that I can know and that I desire to know. Telepathy, therefore, presents no difficult inner force or mental process for me. Chapter 4, A Technique for Experimental Telepathy. How to define the proper approach, mental and physical states during the experiment, how results should be reported and evaluated, some subjective analyses by students. And so she says, when I desire to receive in a telepathic experiment, I begin first to breathe down in extremely deep breaths, as though breathing below the diaphragm. As the breath goes below, the stomach is pushed out, and the breath forces the muscles in the abdomen to relax. I become aware of a cessation of mental effort, and all of my bodily rhythm is concentrated below the belt. I then feel that I am in a true relation with my creative self, and that my emotions are in control. From that moment, anxiety, any question of error, and insecurity of interpretation are over. I am quite certain in my own mind that I am alert in consciousness and ready to start work. The emotional process for reception is pure placidity. I see myself as plastic, empty, and at perfect rest. I have nothing to do except automatically to describe what is appearing before my inner vision. But for telepathic transmission, the process is different. All of the perceptions are quickened, and it seems as though hearing, seeing, sensing, and knowing have tied themselves to a white beam, which is sent hither and thither as the will calls upon it to obey. For instance, if the ray is cut out or interfered with, the faculties bend around it, bended around the obstacle, which is felt, though not always seen. To perceive trained, for the percipient trained in telepathic reception, there is a faint sense of something happening, quote unquote, during the moments of reception, while the projecting agent invariably feels a sense of alertness at all times. The percipient may feel a faint electric tingling or warmth. There is a tactile response, and goose flesh may appear on the skin. To me, these sensory experiences seem to serve almost like the ringing of a telephone bell, calling upon me to take notice, to permit the message to come through. Any slight suggestive image must be noticed and accepted on faith, and put down for what it is, not interpreted by mental association. The great obstacle to getting telepathic messages is lack of faith in what happens. Follow the deepest dream. Deeper, always deeper. Good advice for any artist, and good too, I believe, for anyone who tries to work clairvoyantly. Chapter 5. Telepathy in Dreams and Under Hypnosis. The dream, the daydream or reverie, and hypnosis are compared and contrasted. Examples of telepathy in dreams. Hypnosis is a two-edged sword. I personally, under hypnosis, can produce telepathic results, but that may be because I believe the trance states with which I have long worked have been brought about by a process of self-induced suggestion. I query sometimes whether under hypnosis I am not unconsciously using my own escape mechanism rather than submitting to the hypnotist. This, however, would probably not be true for others who do not use a trance mechanism for subduing conscious perceptions. And certainly I must admit that I was helped by hypnosis in the early days when I first began to take my mediumistic impressions seriously, and to work as a trance medium. I made use of hypnosis at that time to help me place my mental consciousness in repose and to banish the negative aspects that arose daily in the beginning of my work for others. I suspect that I had always been able to use my trance states as a method of release and escape. And she continues, it should be understood that while I resorted to hypnosis as a means and ways of freeing myself to use my consciousness more easily, I do not believe that it is necessary to make use of such measures in order to produce pure telepathic functioning, unless we are going to make a deep and concrete study of the ways of the working of the mind and emotions. During the early days of my training to use my sensory perceptions in trance mediumship, I accepted hypnotic treatment for almost a year under the care of Hewitt Mackenzie at the British College of Psychic Science in London. I did this for two reasons. First, I did not wish to be confronted with any of the trance material, as one is at times confronted with one's dream material. I think that deep in my heart, I so doubted the validity of the trance material that I wanted to wipe it away from my consciousness. And the other reason was tied up to this, in a way. It was also a protective one. It was a desire to believe in my trance material, and therefore I wanted to keep the validity of it in its own chamber, where I could not, by any possible desire of my own, conscious or unconscious, destroy it. And apparently this hypnosis was highly successful. And she continues to say, I cannot recommend hypnosis as a safe medium for ordinary experimentation. I never make use of it in working with other people. In fact, I do not believe that it should ever be introduced except under medical supervision. It is far better to leave well enough alone and to get to know our emotional selves in a more familiar manner. The moment that we seek consciously to relax the reasoning barriers and to know ourselves sincerely, we make a direct approach to our creative selves. I believe that through this approach we may defeat the dark areas of fear and egoism, which make us, in spite of our desires to the contrary, a hindrance rather than a help to humanity. Chapter 6: The Therapeutics of Telepathy. Illustrations of telepathic healing. Telepathy helps personality dissociation. It in no sense impinges on the field of medicine, the function of breath control, the importance of telepathy during periods of chaos. And she says, with the help of telepathy and its associated perceptions, I have effectively changed the sensory stimuli of the weak, the distressed, and the ill. All forms of mental attitudes can be changed and eventually displaced by the projection of other stimuli than are originally in the mind of the patient. Fatigue and confusion are lessened. As soon as one allows a patient to feel that he is within his own hallucinations and visions, a means and ways to help himself, he will readily receive other impressions in place of his own. You have recreated a new world of understanding for him. After all, everyone knows how often effective healing is made possible by certain visual and oral stimuli, and the telepathic technique which I have described is merely an extension of a more common and accepted therapy. Desirable mental attitudes have to be established if the fear and destructiveness of today are to be banished. There is no easier way to accomplish this than by allowing the patient to receive the necessary new mental approach by means of telepathy and sensory stimuli which can be afforded him through the unspoken suggestion. By this method, no technique has been consciously inflicted upon him to disturb his own ego. His emotional need has caught the sustaining help for which his soul hungered. And then she says, it must be clearly understood, before continuing this discussion, that the therapeutic work which I do in no sense impinges on the field of medicine. I would be the last to attribute recovery of damaged tissues or organs to telepathic suggestion. My work rather lies in an ability to diagnose, through a telepathic or clairvoyant rapport, ills which have their roots in a dissociation of personality. After all, intense mental confusion existing over a period of time can produce serious physical disintegration. When a reorientation of a patient's approach to living can be effected by suggesting telepathically the causes of his disjunction to himself, then nature can begin to repair the damage which has been done, and the patient at last can work much more positively with his physician in assisting nature's healing. I mean, a note from the reader here, there is such work that can heal at the cellular level, in terms of just speaking to your own body, or some folks that do Reiki healing, if you believe in that. I believe what she was talking about here is just one person to another, but there are definitely many cases of folks healing themselves on the cellular level, by tapping into this very similar kind of work, into that super consciousness or oversoul. And this is the kind of work that Dolores Cannon does in a way. So maybe not exactly using telepathy or clairvoyance, but it's definitely tapping into those same pools, if you will. And so the writer continues, at one time, I kept a record which I believe amounted to more than 1,000 cases of this material, of those times in which I had been able to get an accurate impression of the ailments and troubles of a patient as much as a day before I had occasion to meet him. It may be that some essential release has taken place in the sufferer's mind as the moment of the mutual contact draws near, because very often I have had clear clairvoyant evidence an hour before the time of my appointment as to what my next visitor would look like. In addition, some of his outstanding ills would present themselves to me in pain and troubled situations in which I seemed to be cast to play a role. And a note from the reader here, this is in terms of diagnosing somebody and reading somebody's ailments like that from a distance, and this is actually quite common, and Silva outlines this in his book, The Silva Mind Control Method. All right. And so the writer continues, one night I felt particularly despondent about my inability to make any recovery. I had already suffered a third relapse and had reached the point where I had little wish to live, if living meant such continued suffering. I began in a dreamy way to ask myself if there was not some help that could be procured through spiritual prayer, and if such help were forthcoming, I wondered what would be the manner of its reception, and whether the emotional self would be aware of the help received. Thinking thus, I heard a noise as though someone were opening the door of the room cautiously. I looked for my nurse, but she was sitting in a corner quietly reading. Seeing no one enter, I occupied myself with a different train of thought until I became aware that someone other than the nurse was in the room. Even as I realized this, I saw a tall man by the bedside. I looked at him with intense interest, but I could only guess what his features were. He wore a long gray garment that completely covered his body, and a hood attached to his robe showed only a mirage outline of his face. He was very tall and suggested a man of middle age, possessing great vitality and strength. At first he made no effort to speak, but bending down he seemed to listen to the rate of my breathing. After a long pause, he straightened himself to his full height, took a long breath, and said, "Yes, you will live. And one day you will realize that you can teach yourself to breathe correctly. Somewhere along the way, you must have lost control of the precise method. Now, breathe with me as you do, slowly, when entering into the superconsciousness that is your own. If you can use the same breathing at night, you will relax yourself to sleep and so get well. With these words, he walked towards the door and was no more. So this is when I think she had pneumonia or something really crazy, after some travels in Marseille. All right, and so the writer continues. A deeper knowledge of telepathy, therefore, is but the beginning of a desire to understand all of the avenues of creation within the self. I believe that a method of approach to this perception is only the start of a better understanding, and I feel sure that as the world slips into further chaos and pain, the only method by which man can construct a new world for himself is by the fruits of a spiritual desire to know himself. As I worked in France amongst those who fled in front of the German armies, yesterday all had been well for them. Industrialist bankers and happy shopkeepers, I noticed the calm, deep, philosophic peace which had come to so many of them. There was neither hatred nor talk of blaming others. Each one said in his heart, "We ourselves let this happen," and the dignity and calm that possessed them came from within the soul of each of them. Many stories were told in those days of the help that had been given to each one by the process of seeing a mother or some other long-dead relative who appeared, and in each case gave directions and strength which enabled the man to reach safety. One young Frenchman, an aviator, told me that his father had appeared and taken the controls of his plane when it seemed that almost certain death faced him. That boy was convinced that his father had flown the ship and so saved his life. An English chemist related the story of how his uncle, killed in the last war, had walked with him and guided him through the burning streets of Amiens. Yet another told of his father bending over and assuring him that he could walk as he lay bleeding on the sands of Dunkirk. And these visions were not confirmed to the armed forces. The Italian peasant, the French fisherman, the Dutch industrialist, the Viennese banker, all men spoke with conviction of that help which they had received in their desperate hour of need. They were visionaries, all of them. And one heard stories each day that reminded one of the sufferings of the early Christians and of their fortitude under persecution that had a strength beyond life. Each one spoke simply of a new world which had opened for each to save them in the face of death. Surely there is no need to await the holocaust of war and its attendant ills and horrors to discover the strength of knowledge that is our divine inheritance. Chapter 7. The telepathic travel in relation to time and space. Repetition is the law of space movement. The concept of time and space, traveling in space, curved pathways in space, and the colors of the curve. Illustrations of the telepathic traveling. If space then is the garden in which all things have their being and growth, it is easy to comprehend how, by the movement of things, I have conceived of my time intervals, and so I have watched the persistence with which movement causes repetition, and as I have watched the flight of the birds and the drift of the clouds and the movement of the light and life within space, I conceive of space as curved. The knowing works two ways. It works consciously, and it works almost in spite of me. yet even then not quite without direction. The conscious direction of my work is selective. When I know that I have to be telepathic and communicate with a particular agent, I am sure in my own mind that there is a process of sympathetic selectivity established between minds. It is this knowing that explains my ability to look backwards and see things that happened in the lives of the already dead, and to look forward as I do with precognition, and see things that happen before they have taken place. The curved pathways vary under differing conditions. They may be either long or short. The short curves I use regardless of distance. In the highly concentrated and experimental telepathy in which I am given a set time interval with which to work. It seems that the shorter the time interval is, the more I find it necessary to hold my short curve in order to make the fullest use of that time interval. I make this curve in space by breathing into a harmony and color world. As I increase my rate of breathing, I increase my sense of color depth, and in this deepening, I find both protection and greater release. It should be explained here that all of my curves in space are colored. The shorter curves partake of colors in deeper tones, and it is by this consciously increased breathing rate that I've become aware of darker shades of red and purple, which I think of as ultra red and ultra purple. These colors are close to black, but are defined and pierced by a light motif, which throws the natal or parent color into bold relief. I might also mention at this point that it has been by my understanding of these two, as yet unrecognized, colors in the spectrum, by my use of them in breathing, and by my ability to make the body a palette in which I can mix and set them, that I find my greatest healing. These colors of the short curve are powerful, and when I use them in healing, they can move pain from any given area in my own body. And if I use these colors as the basis of healing by suggestion to others, strange and inspiring movements in color consciousness take place in those for whom I work, causing them to become aware of a sound and harmony kingdom within their own beings, of which they had hereto been unconscious. I conceive also a greater precision in the short curve. My own watchfulness has taught me that the short curve carries and makes possible the instantaneous meeting of the sympathetic process between minds. It is related to that intense inner knowledge that strikes us in our lives when we meet somebody for a brief moment, or when we see somebody passing us in the street with whom we know, quote unquote, we could be joined in sympathy and understanding where we afforded the opportunity. Through telepathic projection, I sometimes visit my friends, and by the same process they visit me. They are aware of my presence as I am of theirs. Sometimes, in fact, they are too well aware of it. For instance, a friend once wrote me, "I saw you yesterday in a lavender dress," and doubted the validity of my impression, since I always visualize you in black. She was right, however, for it did so happen that I was very pleased with myself on the day in question because of a special lavender dress I was wearing. I have always known this method of thought projection, of traveling in space, because I began it very young. I can use it today with ease and complacency. Perhaps it was originally an escape, but through the technique which I have established, I've become aware of many things. I've actually traveled by this process, and I've seen many things happen, quote unquote, out of time. For it seems that on this curved bridge in space, I am in a place beyond what we are taught to believe is the limitation of vision. Knowing myself there and being a part of everything is my ways and means of participation in all that goes on outside of me. It is this departure from myself into space which refreshes me and permits me to rest for intervals there, even in the midst of extremely interesting conversations. It is there that a knowledge of things to come is often afforded me, and I believe that this is made possible because, as I have already explained, I knew from my earliest observation that all movement was repetitious. If the crows flew out in the dawn, they came home at twilight. If the sun rose, it also set. If a crow died on the way, my seeing of what went on in space made me know that he went somewhere beyond, and out there was the only process I knew of life or death. And so, because of these things, I knew the law that movement is inevitable, repetition leading to endless change. And so today, I build in space my own roadways from here to there and back, where I enjoy the advantage of living in two worlds at once, the mundane world and the world, quote unquote, out there, where the sun never sets and adventure lurks in every breath, where destiny and free will meet, like past and future are irrecoverably wedded. That's a tongue twister. Chapter 8. Telepathy, an approach to other psychic phenomena. The gypsies, the soothsayers, and the fortune tellers. Clairvoyance, clairaudience, psychometry, and automatic writing. The phenomenon of projection. Psychometry, I believe, is accomplished through radiation. The object itself radiates and contains not only its own magnetic field and historical associations, but its own lifetime. It also absorbs the atmosphere and personality of those whom it has belonged, and with whom it has shared its life experience. I have found psychometry invaluable as a method for establishing a sympathetic understanding between myself and those who would seek my help. Very often indeed, the object reveals more of the personality and history of the person than he does himself. Many people are so overlaid with stiffness, shyness, and self-consciousness that they never succeed in revealing their true selves. But an object that they wear or touch or live with, the book they read or the letter they write, will frequently betray the reality of their personalities. I have stated elsewhere that I believe that everything has its own magnetic field in which it moves at its own rate of vibration. This is true of all the so-called inanimate objects, the stone, the tree, and the flower, as well as of the animal and the human being. And the texture of each may be changed, and its shape and form may be fashioned differently, but with its essential being, we cannot interfere. Believing also as I do in the oneness and interrelationship of each state of life with another, it is easy for me to believe that our atmosphere colors our possessions. All of us are familiar with those statements of fact, which we make from time to time when we say, so and so was charming, but I was not comfortable in his presence. And we also say, his manner chilled me, or warmed me, as the case may be. We are all familiar, too, with the atmosphere which we create in the room, which we work, in our office and in our home. We are all hives of chemical industry, and I know this to be true since I know that we carry our chemical surround or magnetic field of radiation with us wherever we go. It is this, then, that makes up the sum total of what we call our personality. It is this that we share with our possessions, and indeed, many of our possessions possess us. It is this radiation which clings indefinitely to an object, for it is of the soul stuff through which we have our growth and being. And so psychometry is essentially when you read objects. So, somebody holds something that belongs to somebody and they tell you everything about that person. That's what that is. So I feel like that was a really great description. And that's all I had that seemed really cool in this chapter. Okay, chapter 9. What telepathy is not. Telepathy is not a product of the imagination. It is not a product of the subconscious. It is neither hysterical, neurotic, or psychotic. A plea for tolerance. I often startle my friends by telling them that I do not think, which becomes true when I am not working consciously. It would seem, then, that my mind holds itself in a quiet and tranquil ease, which is almost devoid of thought. The mind is either creative or completely at rest, still with the stillness of deep, tranquil waters, while lights and clouds of color and imagery are at play. It is only when I am seriously ill or completely exhausted that thoughts persistently occupy the usual calm surface of my mind and continue, and it is then that I complain, by contrast, of knowing the perception of still thought. I have found that in all telepathic perception I am aware of a quickened pulse, a tightening of the skin, especially of the arms, and an intense dryness of my hands. And with this there is a feeling of things about to happen, which brings its own keen anticipation of sensory perception. This is followed immediately by the process of knowing, as apart from thinking. I cannot see in what way this method of communication can be related to the subconscious. A faculty possessed by all men, and probably by most animals, even if developed and utilized by few, should not be debased and ignored because of the woeful neglect of society. As well might one praise the ancient Chinese custom of binding the feet of girl babies, where the poor, helpless woman who could totter at best but a few feet normal, and the peasant woman with her strong, unbound feet abnormal. For just as the upper-class Chinese traditionally bound the feet of the woman, so has society for hundreds of years fettered those sensory faculties and perceptions by which man can communicate without physical media, and so greatly enrich his creative, artistic, and emotional life. For I believe that through the supersensory perceptions, genius, not only a quality of the few, can become an attribute of all human consciousness. I found, however, that people still sought me, whether I used mediumship or not. And then the realization came to me that my perceptions were right, and that by them alone I had managed to live and exist in a world which had little understanding of its own complexes and needs. I saw for the first time that with or without the mechanics of mediumship, I still could heal and help, and constructively use myself for the good of others. This seemed then my destiny, and became all important. It made me realize that I had spent years trying to destroy my own God-given gift of comprehension and spiritual understanding by tabulating and confining the process to a name and method. The world of my sensory experiences is part of the normal world, while the Hag-Riggin neuroticism of the everyday world is more often in itself the world of the abnormal. Therefore, it is out of my deep experience that I do know that the time has come when we may not deny the reality of ourselves. Whatever that is which produces the hunch, the inner voice, the still small voice, the vision, or the fantasy, we must believe that it is still a part of ourselves and can operate for good, as does any limb or member of the body. I make a plea at this point, therefore, that those who have sensory perceptions consciously known to themselves and who have allowed themselves to be forced by society to regard themselves as abnormal will understand once and for all that the only abnormality lies in misrepresentation and misunderstanding of that soul language which is given to each of us. We must each play our role in the dispensation of the knowledge which each role possesses, and which rightly used makes possible that world of peace and usefulness for each one of us that we all seek, alas, sometimes despairingly today. Chapter 10. Telepathy is a creative function. By developing telepathic and clairvoyant powers, creativeness is stimulated. Through the harmony of the body and emotions, the creative self becomes objectified. The world's need for spiritual growth and the part of the individual can play. The clearer the sensory perception, the clearer are our objective reflections of the world in which we live. Mind shapes the perceptions and becomes the critical function which gives finer quality and form to our creativeness. And so the sensory force, of which telepathy is a part, is related to all that is creative and artistic. The world calls aloud for a new order. But what can that order be if we return to any part of that social policy which has caused the collapse of today? The most ardently religious must be shocked in his soul, as I was, when he read of the temporal head of the church blessing the guns, unable to utter one word which would bring peace to a war-stricken world. The humblest thinker today recognizes that the church has often sold out to the banker and to the politician, and we do not have to look very far to realize that the stock market, in spite of what we might like to believe, is the temple where most of the men who led us into our present disasters prefer to pray. For the first time in history, all men are willing to admit that the appalling cupidity of political and church leadership has caused our present fall from grace, and that a mechanical God has taken the place of the golden calf. We are again faced with annihilation through disbelief. It can be said of us, as of the leaders, that we have shut our eyes and ears to the pitiful sounds of the starving and ill in our midst. It is only now that we feel within us the first faint stirring of sadness and regret that, instead of wasting the wealth of the universe in destruction, we might have helped our sick and weary and poor to a decent standard of living. But even this faint groping is encouraging, for it does show that there is great need for spiritual growth for each one of us, and that the time is past when we can wait to seek the answers to our problems of living from others. Communism and fascism are, after all, mere substitutes for man's intrinsic need for God. God can never be divorced from man's need of him. And though man may turn aside for a while to follow false idols and evil prophets, eventually he must return to his basic need. The restless suspicion and the illness of the world today, have happened because we have not listened to the inner voice which is there, whether we know it or not, calling us to decency and inspiring us with growth. Instead of listening to this voice, we have allowed ourselves to be carried along by the sounding notes of the impure, opportunist, and the fanatically minded. And then she finishes, there is a great belief amongst us that this is the road by which prayer reaches the infinite, and man in his desperate need will affirm it. It is not indeed a sign of the changing times when we find that all the great leaders of the day, in their agony and despair, are not ashamed or afraid to say again and again, "Let us put our trust in Almighty God." So, what I find beautiful about this book, one thing I didn't call out is that she grew up in a very, very religious family. Religion was very strong. I think her father was a pastor or something, I don't remember. And um, and even though she has all these gifts, she acknowledges that they're natural, they're inherent in all of us, and that they strengthen with our connection to God. So you can get as scientific about this as you want, which she kind of does in this book. She shows some cases, and it does manifest physically, but, or I should say, and, it's really due to kind of this beautiful back door, or rather the front door. We've been doing things kind of the backwards way, through a deeper connection to God, which is within us and part of us always. And this super consciousness, this oversoul, this other realm that she mentions she taps into, it's always there and it's always available. So there's no getting there. Beautiful book. She was ahead of her time.